Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to ArchiHacks, and today we have another exciting tutorial. We're going to be creating this beautiful aerial shot using Rhino, V-Ray, and Photoshop. And through this project, we're going to explore all kinds of different tools provided by V-Ray, so make sure to stick around till the end to learn all about the latest features. And for those who are new to the channel, if you want to see more great tutorials like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button so that you can see more videos like this on your feed. And that being said, we have a lot to cover, so let's dive right into it. So here is our model that we're going to be working with. This is a luxury mansion in a beautiful landscape. So at this point, there's no textures on it. I just have the model and a view set up so that we can jump right into rendering. So the current setup is that I have two wireframe views to show top and the side, and one for kind of spinning things around. And last one, I'm just gonna go ahead and lock it so that we can get a consistent view every single time. So I'm gonna go ahead and start up a real-time render just to show you what we are starting with. So this is our starting point. There's no exposure or any setup done. There's maybe a minor texture in the swimming pool, but otherwise everything is a blank slate. Let's first go ahead and start figuring out our lighting situation. So right now, as you can see, we have a default lighting going on, and I'm going to test out a variety of lighting conditions by using the V-Ray's Light Gen tool. So go ahead and click on this little button right up here and open up this little window. You can choose between exterior and interior, and since we're at exterior, we'll go with that. And here, you can choose a number of variation you want for altitude and azimuth of your sun. So altitude is obviously the height of the sun, and then azimuth is like the direction where the sun is coming from. And V-Ray will automatically generate all permutations of these lighting setups. So that is why they generate the total of 24 in this scenario. And if you increase the variation, then you'll get more as well. And at this point, what's really cool is that you can start up a interactive rendering and see the changes in real time. So for example, if I go ahead and select this one, for example, as you can see, our interactive rendering is updating immediately. So just by simply clicking on one of these thumbnails, V-Ray will go ahead and set up your sun according to that setup. So this one looks pretty cool. It's pretty nice too. So I'm going to go ahead with this lighting setup. Once I click on it, all the settings gets applied, and I can simply exit out or save this whole series of studies so we can come back to it later. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and close it and move on to our next step. Okay, so next up on our list, we're going to take a look at adding vegetation to our scene. And we're going to source our 3D models from the Cosmos library. So the Cosmos library is like a very comprehensive list of 3D models and assets that you can simply deploy into your scene. And this is great because they make sure all the models are high quality and performant at the same time. So I'll go ahead, head over to our vegetation section and look at some assets that we have downloaded. So feel free to kind of browse through and see what's available. I think for myself, I'm going to go ahead and import in a couple of trees into our scene. Here, that's one. So the way you import them is simply by clicking on this green import icon and then heading over to the Rhino and just clicking on a location where you want to place them. And V-Ray will go ahead and place a proxy for you so it doesn't bog down your system and still keeps the high quality model during the render time. So I've imported 4 variations of trees. Placing them manually can be a lot of hassle, especially when you're working with a large scene like this. On a curved surface like this is honestly painstaking and not an efficient way to work. And that's why V-Ray provides you with a scatter feature. So in order to create a scatter, you can go over to V-Ray Asset Editor, right-click on the geometries or objects, and click on Scatter Object. So what Scatter Object allows you to do, and from here, you can bring in some guests, and I like how they call them as guests. It's kind of cute. and select the trees that we have imported just a moment ago. And then once you hit enter, those guests get added to the party. Oh yeah. Okay, and one more thing before you get started is to choose your density very carefully. So this number indicates the approximate number of instance per square meter. So we have a huge amount of area over here, and had we done 1 per square meter, our system would have frozen up. So what we have to do is reduce this value dramatically. So I'm going to try 1000, maybe something like that, and see what that looks like. Okay, so when everything is ready and double checked, good to go, we're going to go right click on our scatter geometry and apply to selection. And boom, there we go. As you can see, you get a quick preview of where all these instances are, and in the real-time rendering, you can see them over here as well. So now we can safely go ahead and hide these objects, and yeah, our scene is populated. I think I might want to increase the number of objects in the scene, so I'm going to go ahead and increase our density by 5 times. 5 times seem pretty good. Okay. And yeah, what's really great is that they give you a automatic randomness. So the rotation is random. There's a slight variation to scale. So it's been all kind of figured out for you. So it makes your rendering job super easy. So one thing that's kind of bothering me right now is that these trees are intersecting with our building elements. So let's go ahead and I'm gonna split the plane geometry so that we can tell V-Ray where to put the trees and where not to. I'm gonna pause our interactive rendering just for a second and go over to our plan view. I'm gonna maximize this. In case you want to know how I did that with a hotkey, you can watch one of our previous videos to learn how. Okay, so while we are working on plan, I'm just gonna go ahead and go to scatter and change our guest preview mode into none so that it doesn't really distract us. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to kind of trace out our building and make sure that, and kind of cut this geometry out so that it doesn't interfere with our trees. I'm also going to go ahead and create another rectangle, kind of oriented in this direction, so that we can simulate a road later down the road. Alright, anyways, so now our cut geometry is ready. So I'm going to use that to trim our big plane right over here. So let's type in split and choose a cutting object that is the curve that we just chose. And now that plane is split into 2 pieces. There we go. And I'm going to make sure that this cleared area doesn't have any trees growing. So to do so, I'm going to go down to Properties, to V-Ray tab, and ensure that scatter is chosen to none. So scatter is on this plane, but not on this one. Okay, that setup is complete, and let's see how that looks like in our preview. As you can see, most of the trees are gone, and this one seems to be a little close. So for situations like this, I think it's enough to just kind of play with the seed setting. So sometimes you might want to try out like a different randomization. So this is when you can kind of play around with the seed value. And yeah, the second value seems to work pretty well. But as you can see, this kind of like mixes things up a little bit. And what's really cool is that you can always come back to the same number and expect the same result. So I'm going to go back to 2 because I think that was the best one. Okay, so now one of the biggest elephant in the room right now, I think, is the ground. I think that's going to make a huge difference once we put in a proper ground texture. And to do so, I'm going to utilize Cosmos again. And for that, I'm going to go down into Online section, into the Materials section, and choose Ground. These are really similar to, and I've already downloaded this dirt gray stones texture. And once you have downloaded it to your computer, you can simply drag and drop this into the scene. And boom, it gets applied automatically. Isn't that amazing? And now another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some asphalt texture and also download and drag and drop into our scene. So I'll do the same thing, and boom, we have road texture and ground texture added already. Yeah, what's really cool is that this texture is meant to be 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters in dimensions, but at the current scale, it actually looks pretty good. Like these little sand is kind of looking out to become like boulders at our scale. So this is not something I expected, but I think we could roll with that. We're getting fairly close to what we are looking for. Okay, so another thing I want to do is that I want to add some render elements. And I typically add two things, but you can choose from a variety of choices as well. But for today, I'm going to get a render material random color and bump normal textures. These are going to be very useful when we are doing some post-processing in Photoshop. So make sure to put those in your render backpack so that you are ready to go next time. One thing I might want to try is actually using the V-Ray vision. So if you're familiar with using Inkscape, you probably know what to expect. So this is a real-time rendering engine for previewing different geometries and your Rhino project. What's really cool is that this is specifically kind of meant to work with V-Ray ecosystem. So as you can see, when we are working with a heavy proxies like this, they quickly generate these previews in these little blobs so it doesn't bog down your system. You can of course turn them into high fidelity model for presentation or screenshot purposes. And since this tutorial is already pretty long, we will save that for another time. Okay, so this is a really good way to get a good understanding of your scene before you get started. As you can see, like there's almost no delay and everything looks beautiful. I know it's not like photorealistic, like ray tracing quality, but honestly, this will pass for like majority of your exploration cases. But anyways, I feel pretty confident about this render, so I'm gonna go ahead and set up for our final render. And for that, I'm gonna disable interactive, increase the quality to maximum, and choose a V-Ray denoiser. V-Ray denoiser tends to take a little bit more time, but it tends to be more accurate. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the setup. And for the render output resolution, I'm going to go ahead and choose 1920 by 1080 resolution. If you're printing this, you might want to increase the resolution by at least twice, if not 4 times, just depending on the size of your drawing. And I'll go ahead and start this render. Okay, so our rendering is finished. And right before we get started, I felt like we could use a little bit of color correction and maybe adjust our exposure so not everything is totally blown out. So, instead of like re-rendering the whole thing on the spot, what we could use is the color correction tools provided in the V-Ray frame buffer. So if you simply just like drag this little toggle on the right, you'll get all these menus on. And the first one is the display correction that gives you the option to change the exposure without damaging the quality of your image. So as you can see, I can lower the setting or go over on the exposure side. So you might be wondering, how is this any different from just doing this in Photoshop? Well, the difference is that once you export these images, they become flat JPEG images. However, when you're editing in the VFB editor like this, the image is still in its raw format. And raw means sort of like, so there's a lot of information, for example, in the shadows that is not visible right now, but it becomes more visible when you increase the exposure in the VFB. However, had you exported this image into JPEG format, that would have been lost. So I recommend you do as much editing as possible in the VFB editor, and then once you think you have all the information you need on the screen, that's when you export it into the Photoshop. So honestly, I think that looks pretty good. I just lowered it just a little bit. I think I might also want to use curves adjustment to make some adjustments as well. So to do so, I can simply click on this plus layer button and choose from curves, color balance, or all these different kind of filters that you're probably familiar with from Photoshop. Yeah, V-Ray's curve work in an interesting way. They give you these like little Bezier curves, so you can use that to make adjustments. So what I like to do from raw rendering, I like to create the inverse S shape so that we can reduce the contrast and kind of like prime the rendering for more neutral phase. And if you're using any light objects, such as like, the rectangular light or point light or spherical light, the lens effect is actually really useful. You can enable this bloom slash glare, and it gives you a really realistic star and like nice little glow around the light. But unfortunately, this particular scene doesn't have any, so we're not going to see much of a difference. But if you do have some, make sure to enable this to get an optimal effect. So I'm going to go ahead over to the file, save all images, image channels to a separate file, and import them into Photoshop. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop. I've imported 3 images. First is the effects result. The next one is the bump normal. And the last one is the material random color. So I'm going to go ahead and pull them into our main composite. And you can simply drag them in just like so. And if you hold down shift, you can ensure that they land in the exact same place. So I'll do that for this one. Okay, now I think all the scenes are ready. And we are ready to Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and create some color adjustments. So let's go over to the adjustment tab and create curves. I know it sounds a little counterintuitive, but I actually wanted to just show you the VFB color correction method. So yeah. So I'm going to add in the usual S-shaped curve just to bring in some more contrast, like so. Then I'm going to go over to our material random color, select the leaves of the trees. And what's really cool about working with a single ecosystem is that there is a single language going on. As you can see, even though we've imported different kinds of trees, all the leaves are identified as one material ID, and all the tree trunks are identified as another one. So you don't have to like scramble to like find the right color for different trees imported from different sources. This is all done and taken care for you. So I'm going to go ahead over to our magic wand, and I'll turn off contiguous so that we can select everything at once and click on the green. Now I'll unisolate this area, and with this selected, I'm going to go ahead and click on hue and saturation and turn the hue so that the trees look a little bit more brown, almost reddish, so that we get a kind of like an autumn look to the trees. Okay, that looks pretty good. And now what we can do is that we can take a kind of like a soft brush and start erasing away on parts that we want to kind of restore into green. So for example, I'm going to take the black brush, choose our mask for the hue and saturation, and start painting in some areas to kind of like randomly give some more variation. Right now the opacity is 100, but I'm going to reduce that to 30% to simulate like the mid-tone, like the transition time. Sometimes there's like one tree that's just green. Sometimes the whole family is like transforming together. So think about all these different kind of scenarios and kind of build it up to your own imagination. Okay, so a couple more things I would like to do maybe is just to add some more cheesy effects. I don't know, sometimes they just look good. And this part is totally voluntary. You don't have to follow this if you're not into it. But I'm going to add some more glare coming from the sun and maybe add a bit of vignetting to kind of bring more focus to our building. So I'm going to go ahead, take our gradient tool and start drawing some gradient. It's probably coming slightly from above in that direction. I'll change the blending mode to screen and reduce the opacity to maybe about 50%, 40%. And the light is looking a little pale, so I'm going to go ahead and change that using hue and saturation. I'll colorize it and go for a slightly orangish color that kind of goes well with the fall. And yeah, overall it looks a little desaturated, so I'm going to go ahead and create a hue and saturation layer and increase the saturation just a touch. That looks pretty good. And last but not least, I'm gonna create another gradient to kind of simulate vignette effect. So for that, I'm gonna choose a radial gradient and draw one from the center of our scene. Maybe a little bit bigger. Oops. That looks pretty good. And now I'm gonna go over to select, color range, and choose highlights to get a selection of the whites in the current gradient. And that gives us a nice soft selection around the corners. And now with that selected, I can take, let's say, a brush tool and paint in some black areas that we want to darken just a little bit. Like so. I can always erase to correct it. And when you think it's ready, I'm gonna choose Ctrl D to deselect and change the blending mode to something a little bit more wholesome. Even with overlay, the vignetting looks a little too dark, so I'm gonna reduce the opacity to maybe about 40%. And that is our final image. So let me do a quick comparison before and after. This is with the effects, without the effects. I'll make a copy of this. So this is before, and this is after. I think that really brought some light to the scene. And if you happen to create new renderings with some of these tools, feel free to tag us on Instagram, and we will share it on our profile as well. V-Ray comes with such a jam-packed load of great features that we could barely cover like half of the features that are provided by them today. And each feature has so much depth that I think each of them deserves a tutorial on their own. So we will probably follow up with more detailed guide on things like V-Ray Vision and exploring more options in V-Ray Cosmos and maybe HDRI setup. So let us know in the comments what you would like to see first, and we'll get to that as soon as possible. And thanks again Chaos for sponsoring this video. And you guys already know I'm a big fan of Chaos Group's V-Ray products, so this has been an amazing collaboration. We'd love to have more in the future. Anyways, that being said, thanks for tuning in guys, and I'll see you guys next time.